Why the environmental movement keeps losing. I could be wrong, but I think I'm finally starting to understand why the environmental movement is perhaps the only progressive cause that not only hasn't made much progress in decades, but is losing ground on almost every front, as in literally losing ground. And no, I'm not talking about the merry-go-round of rogue administrations, painful legislative setbacks, or even large demographics on the opposite side of an issue. I'm talking about how nearly every single benchmark, whether it's land degradation, wildlife populations, toxic pollution, CO2 emissions, is going in the wrong direction and increasingly so. To be very clear, I'm not trying to take anything away from the valiant efforts and many victories of environmentalists, including myself, over the years. There's no question that a great deal of land, air, water, and species have been protected from our important work, and I think anyone who is or was part of that should be celebrated. But I hope we can agree that the ecological crisis is continuing to worsen, and while there are many lessons to learn from the past, can we really pretend our current approach is enough to get the job done? Don't worry, we can still blame the system. Because of course capitalism doesn't just allow for ecological destruction, it requires it. Of course most corporations, especially monopolies without competition, continue to treat the natural world as its private resource colony. Of course most government agencies provide little to no accountability for such plunder, and in fact often eagerly facilitate the destruction. Of course, most elected officials remain either openly hostile to environmental protection or else pretend to care while causing the same harm. Of course, most of the media, both traditional and alternative, has devolved into little more than political party operatives or ideological opinion making. Of course, most foundation-funded big greens have become indistinguishable from the corporations and government agencies they're supposed to be challenging. But let's not forget that there's a sizable percentage of humanity that does care about nature and wants to see it genuinely protected. But while a handful are actively doing something about these issues, the overwhelming majority are not. And I think it's time that those of us in the grassroots environmental movement accept that it's up to us to evolve our strategy to better inspire and engage them. Naturally, a lot of our failure comes from fragmentation in terms of what our goals might be, which is why I and others have long advocated for a stronger, more unifying message so we can become, in the words of the late great David Brower, quote, a nucleus around which activists can build and function, unquote. Part of this is a clear articulation of what we actually stand for. For instance, as crucial as it is for advocates to focus on specific campaigns close to their hearts, whether that's fighting fossil fuels, mining of uranium or precious metals, logging forests, grazing cattle, polluting waterways, if we don't share common ground for our ultimate aim, at best we'll end up disjointed and spread too thin, and at worst, working against one another. My take is that part of the problem is the use of the vague and nebulous term environment, a demoting of the natural world to nothing more than a backdrop for human activity, a kind of living green screen. It makes us forget about the self-sustaining ecosystems that are the source of all life since time immemorial. So perhaps a more universal approach as an alternative to environmentalism might be the concept of ecosystem advocacy, where our mission is to provide a voice for the living forests, prairies, deserts, mountains, rivers, swamps, and oceans, saying what they would in their own defense if only they could find the words. In the US, this can involve pushing for an end to all extraction, logging, mining, drilling, and grazing, on public lands as a way to abide by the global biodiversity framework of bringing, quote, the loss of areas of high biodiversity importance, including ecosystems of high ecological integrity, close to zero by 2030, or the larger half-Earth strategy as outlined by biologist E.O. Wilson. Once we agree on a comprehensive positive vision, all our local, regional, and national grassroots organizing can start feeling like it's making some measurable progress towards a well-defined international target. However, as important as unified goals and messaging are, I no longer believe that proper framing is enough to turn things around. Because even if this gets more advocates on board, I think the majority of the public still feels disempowered and hopeless and don't want to spend their lives pointlessly tilting at windmills. I'd say that in order for the ecosystem advocacy movement to prosper, we have to go beyond the political and into the culture. And when I say culture, I mean the dictionary definition, which is, quote, a pattern of human knowledge, belief, and behavior, unquote. In other words, could it be what we're missing? And what could get our movement winning again is creating a culture of ecosystem advocacy. That's all well and good to say that, right? But how does one even go about such a thing, especially in today's consumerist, sensation-driven, and often delusional culture? Well, that's why we need a movement to figure it out. But here's what I've got so far. Knowledge. From childhood through adulthood into old age, what if we made a conscious effort to learn more about the natural living ecosystems that came into being long before humans and will exist long after we're gone? This can be done through reading scientific studies or science writing, but also through essays, podcasts, documentaries, or even fiction. But perhaps the most important way to gain knowledge about nature is to go out into it on a regular basis and deeply observe. Belief. Perhaps it's time that we accept that the degradation and destruction of planetary ecosystems is nothing less than a crime against nature and humanity, and that advocating for the best interests of these ecosystems, not just what we think is politically fashionable, is not simply what's needed, but an obligation, the rent we pay for living on Earth. Behavior. Building upon knowledge and belief, how about we actively confront the ecological crisis across multiple spheres? Political, as in advocacy, social, as in relationships with other advocates, personal, as in limiting our individual footprint, and spiritual, as in reverence for the rare miracle of life in a vast universe without it. And for these actions to become behaviors, we need to take part on a regular and ongoing basis, whether that's monthly, weekly, or daily. But here's a piece many of us ecological advocates often leave out of the puzzle, both to our movement's detriment and our own. The element of joy. Fair or not, the truth is few people want to engage in desperate, angry activism or hang out with people who do. Which is why if a culture of ecosystem advocacy is to thrive, we've got to socialize more with one another, support each other better, and yes, have fun together. A great way to have more pleasant interactions with other advocates is through celebration, possibly through the arts. I'm not talking about turning into a bunch of hedonists partying for the sake of partying, but as a reward for our good work, to build bonds between those of us who have made this lifelong commitment to the cause underlying all causes, the earth itself. I'm talking about a culture in which, whether or not our actions bear fruit right away, the process itself is fulfilling enough for us to keep going until we do see genuine ecological protection taking root locally, regionally, nationally, and globally. Anyway, that's all I've got so far. If you have anything to add or have your own vision of what a culture of ecosystem advocacy might look like, please post it in the comments or contact me at the Green Root Podcast, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis.